The smile in Room B. The audio recording from Interrogation Room B isn't great. There is this low, persistent hum from a broken fluorescent light overhead and the faint sound of traffic from the wet street outside. But if you listen closely, right around the 14-minute mark, you can hear it. Detective Miller leans across the scuffed metal table. He looks at the suspect, a perfectly average-looking guy in a faded gray zip-up hoodie, and says, "She is gone. We found her body this morning." Normally, this is the part of the recording where everything falls apart. The suspect breaks down. They cry, they stutter, they stammer, they slam their hands on the table and deny it. But the guy in the hoodie doesn't do any of that. He just stares at the table for a long, quiet moment. And then, slowly, the corners of his mouth start to twitch. He looks up at the detective and he smiles. A wide, genuine, almost relieved smile. And honestly, that is the exact moment this case stopped being a standard police procedural and turned into an absolute nightmare. But to understand why that smile is so deeply horrifying, we have to step back. We have to rewind 72 hours back to a completely unremarkable Tuesday evening in mid-November. Now, at this point, you need to understand who Sarah was. Sarah Jenkins was 32, a high school biology teacher living in a beige, split-level house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in suburban Ohio. If you looked at her life, there was zero indication that she was on a collision course with anything violent. Her biggest problem that week was a slow leak in her guest bathroom sink and trying to get her golden retriever, Buster, to stop digging up the hydrangeas by the fence. It was one of those cold, damp Midwest evenings where the sky turns dark by 4:30 p.m. and everyone just wants to stay inside. Sarah got home from the high school around 5:15 p.m. We know this because her neighbor, a retired mechanic named Arthur, was out blowing leaves and saw her pull her aging Subaru into the driveway. She waved at him. Totally normal. She carried in a plastic bag of groceries, checked her mailbox, and locked the front door behind her. Inside, the house was just ordinary. The smell of stale coffee from that morning was probably still lingering in the kitchen. She flipped through a stack of junk mail on the laminate counter, mostly car dealership flyers and utility bills. She heated up some leftover pasta in the microwave. She wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't jumping at shadows. At the time, this didn't seem strange at all. She was just a tired woman winding down after a long day of grading papers. And that is what makes what happened next so hard to stomach. Because the terror didn't announce itself with a loud crash or a masked man kicking down the front door. It seeped in, quietly, while she was just trying to live her life. The first sign that something was wrong didn't actually happen until Thursday morning. Gary, a postal worker who had been walking this specific neighborhood route for 4 years, noticed something a little off. Sarah's green garbage bins were still sitting out at the curb. Wednesday was trash day. Sarah was the kind of meticulous homeowner who always pulled her bins back to the side of the garage before 6 p.m. on the dot. But here they were, 48 hours later, blocking the curb. Now, Gary didn't immediately assume the worst. People forget their trash. People get the flu. Humans are imperfect, and we usually rationalize away the weird stuff because the alternative is too scary to think about. So, he just walked up the driveway holding a small Amazon package. But as he stepped onto the concrete front porch, he paused. There was a sound coming from the other side of the heavy oak front door. It wasn't a television, and it wasn't a radio. It was Buster, the golden retriever. But he wasn't barking aggressively at the mailman like he usually did. He was whining. A low, rhythmic, almost desperate scratching and whimpering against the base of the door. Gary stood there for a few seconds. The morning air was freezing, and the neighborhood was dead quiet. He looked to his left, at the large front living room window. The blinds were drawn tightly closed, but one single plastic slat in the dead center of the window was snapped, bent completely backward, like someone had frantically tried to look out or someone had tried to look in. Gary felt a sudden cold knot form in his stomach. He didn't know why, but he felt an overwhelming instinctual urge to get off that porch. He set the package down on the welcome mat, very quietly, and backed away. He told himself she was probably just sleeping in. He told himself not to overreact, which actually mattered later. Because while Gary was standing in the freezing cold, trying to convince himself that everything was perfectly fine, Sarah had already been dead for 2 days. It took another 6 hours before anyone actually called the police. And honestly, you can't really blame her sister Emily. Emily lived a town over, and they usually texted on Thursdays. When Sarah didn't reply to a morning meme, Emily just figured she was busy grading those papers. But by 4 p.m., when Sarah's phone went straight to voicemail, Emily got that little itch in the back of her brain, that human instinct that quietly whispers, something isn't right. So she called in a wellness check. Officer Greg Miller caught the call. He was an older guy, just a few years out from a pension. At first, he assumed it was nothing. You know how it is, 9 times out of 10, the person is asleep, or they lost their phone, or they're just avoiding the world. He walked up the same concrete driveway the mailman had, heard the same dog whining behind the heavy oak door, and decided to check around back. The backyard was perfectly ordinary, just a faint winter breeze rustling the dry bushes. But as Miller stepped onto the wooden back deck, his radio crackling softly on his shoulder, he stopped. The glass pane on the back patio door was shattered. Now, at this point, Miller's training kicked in. He drew his weapon, called for backup, and stepped inside. The house was freezing. The thermostat had been cranked down, or maybe it was just the biting draft from the broken door. The first thing he noticed was the smell. It wasn't the smell of death, at least, not yet. It was the sharp ammonia scent of dog urine. Buster, the golden retriever, had been locked inside for 2 days, pacing nervously in the hallway. And then, Miller saw the living room. It looked exactly like what you picture when you hear the word burglary. Drawers from the oak console table were yanked out, mail and papers scattered everywhere. The flat-screen TV was knocked off its stand. And there, near the edge of the rug, lay Sarah. We aren't going to linger on the gruesome details of the body, because the reality of a crime scene is usually far sadder than it is cinematic. She had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the back of the head. It was quick, but it was brutal. She was still wearing the sweatpants from Tuesday night. For the first 48 hours, the police were absolutely convinced they knew exactly what had happened. It's a sad, predictable story, right? A random break-in. A woman for its sing-along. A burglar gets startled, panics, and strikes. The narrative was so neat, so tragically common, that detectives immediately started canvassing the neighborhood looking for local repeat offenders. They even zeroed in on a guy named Ricky, a local petty thief who had been stealing power tools from open garages in the area. Ricky had a record. Ricky had no alibi. Ricky was visibly nervous when they talked to him. It all fit perfectly. Except it didn't. Because when lead detective Vance started walking through the crime scene on Friday morning, nursing a fresh cup of terrible precinct coffee, the botched robbery theory completely collapsed. Vance was a guy who looked for the mundane contradictions, the messy, imperfect details that didn't fit the neat little narrative. He noticed that Sarah's purse had been dumped onto the kitchen island, lipsticks and receipts tossed everywhere but her leather wallet, containing over $100 in cash, was still sitting right there on the counter. The TV was knocked over, but it hadn't been unplugged from the wall. The cords were still wrapped neatly in a zip tie. And then there was the glass. Remember the shattered back patio door? Vance looked closely at the sliding track. The glass wasn't scattered on the kitchen floor. It was sprayed outward, sparkling across the wooden deck outside. The door hadn't been broken from the outside to get in. It had been smashed from the times inside. Someone hadn't broken in to kill Sarah. Someone had killed Sarah and then spent 20 awkward, frantic minutes tearing up her house to make it times look like a robbery. Which meant it wasn't a random burglar. It was someone who knew her. Someone who needed an alibi. Someone who wanted the police to look exactly where they were looking. Attention immediately pivoted to Sarah's inner circle. And it didn't take long to find a glaring red flag. Her recent ex-boyfriend, Mark. They had dated for about 8 months. The breakup was fairly recent, and according to Sarah's sister, it hadn't been mutual. Mark had been texting her incessantly. Nothing overtly threatening, just annoying, persistent, pathetic messages. "Why are you ignoring me? Can we just talk? I saw your car was home." So, detectives called Mark in. They didn't treat him as a suspect initially. They just needed to inform him of her passing and see how he reacted. This is a standard procedural beat. You sit them down in the fluorescent lit room, you offer them a styrofoam cup of water, and you watch their body language. Detective Vance sat across the metal table from Mark. Mark was a completely average-looking guy, mid-30s, wearing a slightly wrinkled blue polo shirt. He looked tired. Ordinary. "Mark," Vance said, his voice low and steady. "I'm sorry to have to tell you this. Sarah was found dead in her home yesterday afternoon." Normally, people react to this kind of news in very predictable ways. They gasp. They put their head in their hands. They deny it. Sometimes they get angry, stuttering, and stammering. Even guilty people fake a breakdown, squeezing their eyes shut to force out a tear. But Mark didn't do any of that. He sat perfectly still for about 4 seconds. He looked down at his hands, which were resting flat on the metal table. And then he looked up at Detective Vance. And honestly, seasoned detectives still get uncomfortable talking about this moment. Because Mark's lips parted, the corners of his mouth twitched upward, and he smiled. It wasn't a nervous smirk. It wasn't an awkward, inappropriate grimace of shock. It was a slow, genuine smile. A look of profound, terrifying satisfaction. "Is that so?" Mark whispered. Right then, Detective Vance felt a chill run down his spine. He knew he was looking at the killer. The case seemed closed. They had the motive, they had the staged crime scene, and they had the absolute creepiest reaction in the history of the precinct. But they were wrong. Mark didn't kill her. In fact, Mark's chilling smile was hiding a truth far, far darker than a simple crime of passion. Detective Vance was ready to slide the paperwork across the table and slap the cuffs on Mark right then and there. He had the motive, the creepy behavior, and now the most damning sociopathic reaction he'd ever seen in an interrogation room. But there is this frustrating, immovable thing in police work called an alibi. When detectives actually pulled Mark's records, the entire case against him instantly evaporated. At 2:15 a.m., the exact window the medical examiner had pinpointed for Sarah's death, Mark was 30 miles away. He worked the graveyard shift at a massive logistics warehouse. And he wasn't just on the schedule, he was captured on no less than 14 different high-definition security cameras, scanning barcodes under harsh fluorescent lights from midnight until 8 a.m. It was physically impossible for him to have been at Sarah's house. So if Mark didn't kill her, why on earth did he smile? Now, at this point, the investigation had to pivot back. But Vance couldn't let Mark's reaction go. It bothered him. It felt like an itch he couldn't scratch. They couldn't arrest Mark for the murder, but they could get a search warrant for his apartment based on his admitted history of stalking her. And what they found inside Mark's messy, stale-smelling one-bedroom apartment completely blew the case wide open. Sitting right on his kitchen counter, next to a stack of junk mail and an empty pizza box, was a cheap plastic SD card reader plugged into a laptop. And next to that was a small, battery-operated audio recorder. The kind you'd buy at a drugstore for $30 to record college lectures. Mark, in his obsessive desperation, had broken into Sarah's house 3 days before she died. He hadn't hurt her. He had simply slipped the voice-activated recorder under the sofa in her living room, hoping to catch her talking to another man. But that's not what he caught. You have to picture this. 3 exhausted detectives huddled around a cheap Dell monitor in a cramped precinct office, the air smelling like burned coffee, as they clicked on an audio file timestamped for the night of the murder. First, there's just dead air, the faint, ambient hum of Sarah's refrigerator. Then, at 2:08 a.m., the microphone picks up a sharp, startling crash. The sound of the back window breaking. There's a long pause. You can hear footsteps walking across the hardwood floor. Heavy, deliberate steps. Then, the creak of a bedroom door opening. You hear Sarah's voice. She sounds groggy, confused, but not terrified. At least, not yet. "Emily?" Sarah says, her voice thick with sleep. "What are you doing here?" Emily, her older sister, the same sister who had sat in the precinct just hours earlier, weeping into a tissue, pointing the finger at Mark. On the tape, Emily doesn't yell. She doesn't scream. Her voice is chillingly calm, echoing slightly in the small hallway. "You shouldn't have kept the house, Sarah. Mom wanted it to be mine." You know she did. And honestly, listening to the recording, the sheer mundanity of it makes it so much worse. It wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a random burglary. It was a petty, bitter dispute over a modest, single-story inheritance that had been brewing for months behind closed doors. On the tape, Sarah starts to argue, but it cuts off into a sudden, chaotic scuffle. There are muffled thuds. The horrifying, unmistakable sounds of a struggle. A lamp crashing to the floor. And then, quiet. For the next 20 minutes, the tape just captures the methodical rustling of Emily staging the scene. Pulling out drawers, tossing jewelry boxes, making it look like a robbery gone wrong. When the tape finished playing, the detectives sat in total, stunned silence. They immediately dispatched a squad car to Emily's house. It was a bright, sunny Tuesday morning. Kids were riding bikes on the sidewalk. A neighbor was mowing their lawn. Amidst all this perfectly ordinary suburban life, Emily was escorted out of her front door in handcuffs. When Vance played the audio tape for her in the interrogation room, the color simply drained from her face. She didn't say a single word. She just stared blankly at the table, realizing her perfectly orchestrated lie had collapsed. But there was still one missing piece to this disturbing puzzle: the timeline. If the recorder was under Sarah's couch during the murder, how did it end up on Mark's kitchen counter? Vance brought Mark back in one last time. And this is the part of the story that seasoned cops still have trouble digesting. Mark admitted that on the morning after the murder, before the police were ever called, he had driven to Sarah's house to swap out the batteries in his hidden recorder. He let himself in through the back. Mark walked into the living room. He saw the shattered glass. He saw the blood. He saw Sarah, lifeless on the floor. And he didn't call 911. He didn't rush to her side. His only thought was self-preservation. He quietly reached under the sofa, grabbed his cheap plastic recorder, walked out the back door, and drove home. It was only when he plugged the SD card into his laptop that he heard the tape and realized what had actually happened. Which brings us back to the smile. When Detective Vance had sat Mark down and told him Sarah was dead, Mark hadn't been surprised. He already knew. He smiled because he knew Emily, the sister who had always despised him, the sister who had forced Sarah to break up with him, the sister who had called him a pathetic loser, had just walked directly into a trap. He possessed the one piece of evidence that would send his worst enemy to prison for the rest of her life. He didn't care that the woman he supposedly loved had been brutally murdered. He only cared that he had won. Emily is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Her house was sold to pay for her legal fees. As for Mark, he was charged with trespassing and tampering with evidence. But those are minor charges. He served a few months of probation and paid a fine. He's a free man today, living in a normal apartment, walking down normal streets. Because at the end of the day, being a deeply broken, apathetic human being isn't a life sentence. And there's no law against smiling. The 4-3 second ghost. I promise you, you can watch this 4-3-second security clip 100 times, and honestly, you won't see the murder. You won't see the killer. All you'll see is a tired 9-year-old woman named Maya riding a standard residential elevator up to her apartment. It's Tuesday. She's carrying groceries. Nothing violent happens. Nothing dramatic happens. And yet, this incredibly boring, mundane piece of footage is the only reason police caught the person who ended her life. Now, to really get why this case is so unsettling, we have to start with the ordinary. It was a Tuesday evening in early November. One of those miserable, drizzly nights in the city where the damp just sort of seeps into your bones, and all you want to do is lock your door and turn on the heating. Maya lived in a slightly dated, brick-faced building on the west side. The kind of place with a lobby that permanently smells like stale coffee, old carpet, and maybe somebody cooking onions down the hall. There was a little row of brass mailboxes overflowing with junk mail. It was normal. Very, very normal. Maya was an accountant, and by all accounts, she was a quiet, routine-oriented person. On this specific night, at 6:42 p.m., she walked through the squeaky glass lobby doors. She stomped her wet boots on the mat, checked her mailbox, pulling out a few flyers, and pressed the button for the elevator. At first, the security footage from the elevator camera just shows her waiting. The doors slide open. She steps inside. She presses the button for the 7th floor. The doors slide shut, and the elevator begins its slow, shuddering climb. And honestly, if you've ever lived in an older building, you know that sound. The heavy mechanical clanking, the slight hum of the flickering fluorescent light overhead. Maya shifts the heavy grocery bags in her hands. She glances at her reflection in the metal doors, fixing her hair a little bit. It's a very human, very unscripted moment. She doesn't know she's about to die. She's just tired. But then, the steady climb of the elevator stops. The digital display above the door blinks. Floor 4. The doors slide open. Maya looks up, expecting a neighbor to step in. But there's nobody there. Just the empty, dim hallway of the 4th floor. At the time, this didn't seem strange. We've all been in an elevator that stops on the wrong floor, right? Somebody pressed the button and walked away. Maya just looks a bit annoyed. She shifts her bags to one hand, reaches out, and hits the door close button. But the doors don't close. They just stay open. 5 seconds pass. 10 seconds pass. And this is where the footage starts to get strange. Maya doesn't hit the button again. Instead, her posture completely changes. Her shoulders stiffen. She stops looking at the empty hallway and slowly, deliberately takes a step backward. She presses her back flat against the side wall of the elevator, right underneath the camera's blind spot. She holds her breath. You can see her chest completely freeze. She is terrified. But of what? The hallway is empty. There's no sound on the tape. There is no shadow. There is absolutely no one there. Eventually, after what feels like an eternity, the doors finally slide shut. The elevator resumes its journey to the 7th floor. Maya gets off, hurries down the hall, and unlocks her door. Less than 12 hours later, the building superintendent found her dead inside her apartment. And at first glance, the police thought it was a terrible, tragic accident. There was no forced entry. Her door was locked from the inside. But Detective Miller, the lead investigator who arrived on the scene, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And when he sat in the manager's cramped office, drinking cold, stale coffee and watching that elevator tape, he realized the impossible truth. Maya wasn't looking at an empty hallway on the 4th floor. She had realized something that cost her her life. Now, to understand why Detective Miller was sitting in that stuffy, windowless basement office staring at a grainy monitor, we have to rewind just a few hours to the crime scene. Let's set the scene, because the details here actually mattered later. When Miller first walked into Maya's apartment on the 7th floor, it didn't look like a murder scene at all. The afternoon sun was spilling through the blinds, catching dust motes in the air. The heavy deadbolt on the front door had been thrown from the inside. Even the little brass chain lock was secured. The super had to literally use bolt cutters on the chain just to let the police in. And honestly, when the patrol cops first arrived, they wrote the whole thing off as a tragic freak accident. Maya was lying on the cheap linoleum floor of her kitchen. Beside her were 2 scattered grocery bags. A carton of milk had burst, pooling white liquid around a spilled box of cereal. Her keys were resting on the kitchen island just above her. She had a severe blunt force trauma wound to the back of her head, perfectly matching the sharp quartz edge of the countertop. It happens more often than you'd think, right? People come home exhausted, their hands are full, they trip over their own shoes, and they hit their head. The patrol officers figured she walked in, immediately locked the door behind her, out of city habit, took 2 steps into the kitchen, slipped, and that was it. Case closed. It's an airtight box. Nobody else could have been in there with that chain locked from the inside. At first, Miller kind of agreed. He was tired. It had been a long week, and the scene made logical sense. There were no signs of a struggle. Nothing was stolen. Her laptop was still sitting open on the coffee table. But Miller had this habit of lingering on the mundane stuff, the things people usually step over. He stood in the middle of the kitchen, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, just looking at the mess on the floor. He picked up the crumpled, damp grocery receipt from the puddle of milk. He read it carefully. Bananas, whole milk, oatmeal, bread, and a pint of mint chocolate chip ice cream. Miller looked down at the scattered groceries. Bananas, milk, oatmeal, bread, no ice cream. He hesitated for a second, feeling slightly foolish, and then walked over to the refrigerator. He opened the freezer. There, sitting perfectly upright between a frozen pizza and a bag of peas, was the pint of mint chocolate chip ice cream. And just like that, the false reality of the room completely collapsed. Think about it. Dead people don't put away their frozen goods. Which meant Maya didn't walk in, slip, and die immediately. She came home. She put her keys down. She started unpacking her groceries. She put the ice cream away. Then, times she was killed, which meant the spilled bags near the doorway were staged. Somebody wanted it to look like she dropped them as soon as she walked in. Somebody else was in that room with her. But how? The deadbolt was locked. The chain was secured. The windows were painted shut. This impossible contradiction is what drove Miller down into the basement to watch the building's security tapes. He needed to see her final moments. He needed to understand her state of mind. Which brings us back to that terrifying moment on the 4th floor. Miller watched the tape again. The doors open to the empty 4th floor. Maya waits. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Then her shoulders stiffen. She slowly backs away, pressing herself flat against the elevator wall, sliding perfectly into the camera's blind spot. Her chest freezes. At first, Miller thought maybe it was a glitch. But humans don't react to glitches like that. She wasn't just annoyed. She was hiding. Miller left the basement, got into the elevator, and hit the button for the 4th floor. He needed to stand exactly where she stood. When the doors shuttered open, he looked out. Just like on the tape, there was nothing. Just a long strip of cheap stained carpet and flickering overhead lights. You could see all the way down to the end. If someone had been standing there, she would have seen them. But as Miller stood there, listening to the silence of the building, he heard it. A heavy times creak, followed by the distinct metallic times, clack times of a latch catching. Miller slowly turned his head. Right next to the elevator bank, barely 3 feet away, was the heavy fire door leading to the building's main stairwell. And suddenly, a cold wave of realization washed over him. Maya wasn't terrified because she saw someone in the hallway. She was terrified because she didn't see someone. Imagine you are in her shoes. You are riding up to the 7th floor. The elevator stops on 4. The doors open. That means someone on the 4th floor just pressed the call button, right? But the hallway is entirely empty. However, the second the elevator doors slide open, you hear the heavy stairwell door right next to you slam shut. What does that mean? It means whoever pressed the elevator button didn't want to get on. They pressed it just to see who was inside. And the moment the doors started to open, they ducked into the stairwell. Maya backed into the corner because she realized she was being hunted. The person in the stairwell had just checked to make sure she was in the elevator, and now they were sprinting up the stairs, racing the slow mechanical elevator box, waiting to meet her on the 7th floor. Miller practically ran from the 4th floor back down to the security basement. The room smelled like hot electronics and stale coffee. He ejected the tape and frantically shoved in the master feed for the 7th floor hallway camera. He needed to see what happened when the elevator arrived. He needed to see the monster emerge from the stairs. He found the timestamp, 6:14 p.m. On the grainy monitor, the elevator doors slide open. Maya bolts out. She is terrified. She fumbles her keys, gets her door open, rushes inside, and slams it shut. And then, Miller held his breath, watching the heavy stairwell door at the end of the hall. 8 seconds pass. The door handle turns. The door opens. And out walks a 16-year-old kid. He's wearing a baggy jacket and large headphones. It is just the kid from apartment 7B. He doesn't even glance at Maya's door. He just unlocks his own apartment and goes inside. He was just a teenager who decided to take the stairs for exercise. It was a coincidence. A stupid, meaningless coincidence. The entire hunted theory completely evaporated. Miller slumped back in his chair. He rubbed his eyes. This is the messy reality of police work. You build this terrifying cinematic theory in your head, and then a teenager with a Walkman ruins it. It was a complete dead end. Maya was just a paranoid woman who got spooked by heavy footsteps in a quiet building. But as Miller sat there in the humming basement, a much darker reality began to set in. The impossible contradiction was still staring him in the face. Maya was dead inside her apartment. The windows were painted shut. The deadbolt was locked. And the heavy brass chain was secured from the inside. If the teenager wasn't the killer, and nobody broke in after her, then how did she die? And honestly, Miller said this was the exact moment the air in the basement felt physically heavy. Because if nobody followed her in, it meant when Maya locked that deadbolt and threw that chain, she locked herself in. She didn't know she wasn't alone. Miller leaned forward. He started rewinding the hallway tape. Past 6 p.m. Past 4 p.m. He watched the empty hallway in rapid reverse, the time code flickering in the corner. At 2:15 p.m., the tape showed a man walking down the hall. It was Gary, the building superintendent. He stopped at Maya's door. He pulled out his master ring, found the right key, and let himself inside. Miller watched the tape play forward at normal speed. 10 minutes passed. 30 minutes. 2 hours. Gary never came out. Gary had been inside her apartment for nearly 4 hours before Maya got home. But wait, how did Gary leave? The police report was explicit. When officers arrived for the wellness check 2 days later, the chain was secured from the inside. If Gary killed her, how did he lock a chain from the inside and disappear? Did he climb through the ventilation? Was it some elaborate trick with a rubber band? Miller pulled the tape from 2 days later, the day the body was found, to watch the cops arrive. Now, you have to watch this part very closely. Miller had to replay it 5 times to catch it. The footage shows Officer Reynolds and Gary the Super walking up to Maya's door. Reynolds knocks. No answer. Reynolds gestures for Gary to open it. Gary puts his master key in the deadbolt. He turns it. He pushes the door open about 2 inches, and then the door suddenly stops. Gary turns to the cop and says something. We can't hear the audio, but we know from the police report exactly what he said. It is chained from the inside. We have to shoulder it. Reynolds nods. They back up, and together they violently slam their shoulders into the wood. The door bursts open, the frame splinters, the screws of the chain lock rip out of the drywall, and they rush in. It is the perfect locked room mystery, right? Except Diller had Gary's feet. Miller zoomed in on the grainy green footage. When Gary turned the key and pushed the door open those first 2 inches, there was no tension on the door. He didn't hit a chain lock. Gary subtly wedged the steel toe of his work boot under the bottom of the door, completely stopping its momentum. Gary held the door shut himself. The chain was never attached. Maya never had a chance to lock it. After Gary killed her, he unlocked the door, walked out, and simply locked the deadbolt behind him. When the cops showed up, Gary manufactured the resistance. He made the cop think the chain was engaged. And by kicking the door in alongside the officer, literally tearing the hardware out of the wall, Gary completely destroyed the evidence of his own lie. He created an impossible locked room mystery right in front of a police officer hiding behind the chaos of the moment. It is sickeningly brilliant because it is not a movie villain mastermind. It is just a guy who knows how doors work, thinking on his feet. But the part that kept Miller awake that night, the detail that really sticks to your ribs, isn't Gary's clever trick with the door. It is what happened at 6:14 p.m. When Maya got off that elevator, terrified of an innocent teenager in the stairwell, she ran to the one place she felt safe. You can see it in her body language on the tape. The way her shoulders drop the moment she gets inside and shuts the door. She thought she had won. She thought she had outrun the danger. She turns the deadbolt. She takes a deep breath, and then she turns around into the darkness of her own living room, where a man has been sitting in complete silence for 4 hours, just waiting for her to come home.